incident at the window is a different incident. This is something that Mr. Utterson and Enfield are going to witness. Okay? It chanced on a Sunday when Mr. Utterson was on his usual walk with Mr. Enfield that their way lay once again through the by street, and that when they came in front of the door, they both stopped to gaze on it. Okay. Well, said Enfield, that story's at an end, at least. We shall never see more of Mr. Hyde. I hope not, said Utterson. Did I ever tell you that I once saw him and shared your feeling of repulsion? It was impossible to do one without the other, returned Enfield. And by the way, what an ass you must have thought me not to know that this was a way back to Dr. Jekyll's. It was partly your own fault that I found it out, even when I did. Because Enfield didn't know that blistered door was actually the back door to Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. So you found it out, did you? Said Utterson. But if that be so, we may step into the court and take a look at the windows. To tell you the truth, I'm uneasy about poor Jekyll. And even outside, I feel as if the presence of a friend might do him some good. So they want to walk around to that courtyard area and see if they can spot Dr. Jekyll. Because if you remember, Dr. Jekyll is not coming outside. He's not answering the door to anybody. He's being a recluse right now. But the guys, his best buddies, think, well, maybe if we can get his attention at the window, we can brighten his spirits a little bit. Maybe talk him into coming outside, getting some fresh air. The court was very cool and a little damp and full of premature twilight, although the sky, high up overhead, was still bright with sunset. The middle one of the three windows was halfway open. And sitting close behind it, taking the air with infinite sadness of mien, like some disconsolate prisoner, Utterson saw Dr. Jekyll. What? Jekyll, he said. Hang on. Ugh. I trust you are better. I'm very low, Utterson, replied the doctor drearily. Very low. It will not last very long, thank God. Where am I? Okay. You stay too much indoors, said the lawyer. You should be out, whipping up the circulation like Mr. Enfield and me. This is my cousin, Mr. Enfield, Dr. Jekyll. He's introducing him. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn, yes?
Is Aaliyah Vargas in your classroom right now?
No. Yes. Yes. She was counted absent earlier, though.
But she is there.
But she's here, yes.
Great, thank you.
Sorry about that. All right. So notice that Mr. Enfield had never met Dr. Jekyll. And so they were officially introduced. Mr. Utterson introduced them. Come now, get your hat and take a quick turn with us. You are very good, sighed the other. I should like to very much, but no, it's quite impossible. I dare not. But indeed, Utterson, I am very glad to see you. This is a really great pleasure. I would ask you and Mr. Enfield up, but the place is really not fit. Okay. Why then, said the lawyer good-naturedly, the best thing we can do is to stay down here and speak to you from where we are. It reminds me of during these times of COVID when the older people that are in the nursing homes cannot come out and family members have to come and the only way they're not allowed in. And so they stand outside the windows. Have y'all seen, or maybe your family has had to do that. with one of your family members, had to talk to them through the window. But that has happened a lot with all the people that are living in nursing homes and assisted livings. They're not allowed to have visitors, and they're not allowed to go out because they could get sick really easily. But that's what this scene kind of reminds me of now. And this is the first time I've made the connection, because in years past, when I've read the book, that was, the pandemic was a non-issue. I didn't, had no frame of reference. And so this year, that is what it reminds me of. So, he says, we can stay down here and we'll just talk to you from where we are. That's just what I was about to venture to propose, returned the doctor with a smile. But the words were hardly uttered before the smile was struck out of his face and succeeded by an expression of such abject terror and despair as froze the very blood of the two gentlemen below. Okay? Something must have happened in the look on his face, Jekyll's, that terrified the men. All of a sudden, his expression changed and it scared them. Okay?
Donna,
Yes?
can you please send Aloud Morgan to Dr. Sells' office, please?
Yes.
Is that from when?
Shh. Okay. All right. So they saw it but for a glimpse, for the window was instantly thrust down. Dr. Jekyll slammed the window. Oh, I'm sorry. But that glimpse had been sufficient. They had seen him long enough. And they turned and left the court without a word. In silence, too, they traversed the by-street. It was not until they'd come into a neighboring thoroughfare, where even upon a Sunday there were still some stirrings of life, that Mr. Utterson at last turned and looked at his companion. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. God forgive us. God forgive us, said Mr. Utterson. Maybe he wishes he hadn't gone over there, because he witnessed something that he wished he had not seen. Okay? And maybe that's why he's saying that. Please, God, forgive us. Maybe he feels like he caused it. Marco? There's lots of different movies. Lots of different interpretations on it, too.
You gonna go home and watch it, Marco? Why are they like scared dumb or something?
Well, there is something in Dr. Jekyll's face that apparently scared them all of a sudden. His face changed. The expression on his face, something, they saw something. Now, the fact that the author is not telling us exactly what it was, and he's not telling us enough to understand what's going on, that contributes to the tension, and it contributes to the mood. And the fact that he's leaving stuff out is making us confused, but it's also frustrating because we don't know what's going on. If we just only knew what was going on, we could figure out what the deal is with these crazy characters. But he's withholding information, okay, to create suspense. And the way he describes what's happening is just vague enough to where we're confused. And it forces the mind to say, what is really going on here? Because that's what the author wants us to do, is try to predict what's really going on. And he wants us to predict the wrong thing so that when he reveals it to us in a couple of chapters, we'll be like, oh, yeah. Okay? That's how authors create suspense, by trying to lead us in the wrong direction so that they can surprise us in the end. Something to think about. But does that make sense? It's just some kind of weird change in his face, because that's all they could really see was his face. And then all of a sudden, he slams the window down like he maybe doesn't want them to see him like
I have a
that.
question.
Yes.
Does it look like he had plastic surgery?
I don't know if it was that so much as it's something, it's a look that would have terrorized grown men. Okay? She thinks it's a clown. Clown face? No, but it's something that's scary enough. I don't know that they had killer clowns in the 1800s, Martha. It could be some kind of stare like that.
Like a little.
Okay, let's keep going. They saw it, but for a glimpse. The window was instantly thrust down. The glimpse had been sufficient, though. They turned and left the court without a word. In silence, they traversed the by-street. And it was not till they had come to a neighboring thoroughfare where even on a Sunday there was still some stirrings of life. Mr. Utterson turned and looked at Mr. Enfield. They were both pale, and there was an answering horror in their eyes. And then I stated the dialogue there already. But Mr. Enfield only nodded his head very seriously and walked out once more in silence. The last night. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. Now, who is Poole? Yes, whose butler is he? Dr. Jekyll's. Bless me, Poole, what brings you here? He cried, and then taking a second look at him. What ails you? He said. Is the doctor ill? Mr. Utterson, said the man, there is something wrong. Take a seat, and here's a glass of wine for you, said the lawyer. Now take your time and tell me plainly what you want. You know the doctor's ways, sir, replied Poole, and how he shuts himself up. Well, he has shut himself up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid. Now, my good man, said the lawyer, be explicit. What are you afraid of? I've been afraid for about a week, returned Poole, doggedly disregarding the question. I can bear it no more. The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse. And except for the moment when he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now he sat with the glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. I can bear it no more, he repeated. So Utterson knew something was terribly wrong with Poole for him to be that upset. Come, said the lawyer, I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there's something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is. I think there's been foul play, said Poole hoarsely. Foul play, cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. What foul play? What does the man mean? I daren't say, sir, was the answer, but will you come along with me and see for yourself? Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and great coat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of relief that appeared on the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. So Poole was relieved to know that Utterson was willing to go with him to see what was going on. It was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March with a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her, and a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. It seemed to have swept the streets unusually bare of passengers besides, because it was really cold, so there wasn't anybody outside. For Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. For struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. He didn't like being, it was unsettling for him to be alone in London in those streets that night. He longed to see people. You know, sometimes you are kind of afraid and feeling a sense of doom and you just need to be around people. That's how Utterson was feeling at the time. The square, when they got there, was all full of wind and dust. The thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. So he was so upset that he was sweating. And it was cold, you know. But when he took his hat off, he was sweating. And that just shows you how nervous and worried and upset he was.
Was that kind of a man or
Probably not. This is like leading up to the next event. That's a good question, Chase. Right now, the author is setting you up for the next part of the plot. He's kind of describing the setting right now. Let's see. But for all the hurry of his coming, these were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. For his face was white, and his voice, when he spoke, was harsh and broken. Well, sir, he said, here we are, and God grant there be nothing wrong. Amen, Poole, said the lawyer. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Poole?" "It's all right," said Poole. Let's see, where am I? Open the door. The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth of the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson!" ran forward as if to take him in her arms. What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. "Very irregular, very unseemingly. Your master would be far from pleased." "They're all afraid," said Poole. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Poole said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they all had started and turned toward the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle, and we'll get this through hands at once." And then he begged Mr. Utterson to follow him, and led the way to the back garden. "Now, sir," said he, "you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go." Mr. Utterson's nerves at this unlooked-for termination gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theater, with its lumber of crates and bottles, to the foot of the stairs. Here Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. "Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you," he called, and even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. A voice answered from within. "Tell him I cannot see anyone," it said complainingly. Thank you, sir, said Poole with a note of something like triumph in his voice, and taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen, where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. Sir, he said, looking at Mr. Utterson in his eyes, was that my master's voice? In a little while. It seems much changed, replied the lawyer. Very pale, but giving look for look. Changed? Yes, well, I think so, said the butler. Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him? And why it stays there is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson. So what does Poole think is going on? He doesn't recognize Dr. Jekyll's voice. He thinks somebody else is in there, but that's not Dr. Jekyll. Okay. This is a very strange tale, Poole. This is a rather wild tale, my man, said Utterson, biting his fingers. Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered. What could induce the murderer to stay? That would hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. He's saying, if this guy has hurt Dr. Jekyll or even murdered him, he wouldn't be staying in that cabinet. He'd be long gone, wouldn't he? He wouldn't want to be caught. So that's Mr. Utterson's line of reasoning. Well, Mr. Utterson, you're a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet, said Poole. All this last week, you must know, him or it or whatever that lives in that cabinet has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, aye, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints. And I've been sent flying to all the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it because it was not pure, and another order for a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for. Okay? So whoever is inside the cabinet has been leaving notes outside to direct Poole to go to the pharmacy and get the medicine. And he's got the notes written out of what he wants the pharmacist to mix. Because back in the day, pharmacists mixed the medicines. They made the medicines. And every time Poole would go and get it and bring it back, and it wasn't right. And so Dr. Jekyll would write another note and send it to another pharmacy to try to get it right. And it was like back and forth and back and forth. It was like he needed this medicine. And for one reason or another, he was saying, it's not working. Let's go try again and get a different mixture. Or the mixture was not mixed properly. It's impure. So go somewhere else and see if they can do it, properly. Okay. Do you have any of these papers, these notes? Asked Mr. Utterson. Poole felt in his pocket and handed out a crumpled note in which the lawyer, bending near to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus. Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to the Misters Mall. He assures them their last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 18-something, Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Misters M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care and should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated. So far the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden sputter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. For God's sake, he added, find me some of the old medicine. That's what he means. This is a strange note, said Mr. Utterson, and then sharply, how do you come to have it open? The man at Mauls was main angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like so much dirt, returned Poole. This is unquestionably the doctor's hand, do you know? Resumed the lawyer. I thought it looked like it, said the servant, rather sulkily, and then with another voice, but what matters hand of right, he said. I've seen him. Seen him? Repeated Mr. Utterson. Well, tell me more. That's it, said Poole. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theater from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open, and there he was at the far end of the room, digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in and gave a kind of cry and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I've served him long enough. And then the man paused and passed his hand over his face. These are all very strange circumstances, said Mr. Utterson, but I think I begin to see daylight. Your master, Phil, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice. Hence the mask and the avoidance of his friends. Hence his eagerness to find this drug by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he be not deceived. There's my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, aye, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together. Deliver us from all exorbitant alarms. So Utterson thinks he's figured out what's wrong, and he thinks Dr. Jekyll is sick, and he's frantically, desperately trying to find medicine that can cure him. Okay? I mean, that sounds logical, doesn't it? Based on what Poole has told him. Sir, said the butler, turning to a sort of mottled pallor. He's kind of splotchy. Mottled means splotchy. That thing was not my master. And there's the truth. My master, here he looked around him and began to whisper, is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. I don't think this might be. Okay.
Wait, what happened?
The butler said, my master is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf. Utterson attempted to protest. Oh, sir, cried Poole, do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to in the cabinet door, where I saw him every moment of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll, and it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done. Poole, replied the lawyer, if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to be still alive, I shall consider it my duty to break in that door. Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking, cried the butler. And now comes the second question, resumed Utterson. Who's going to do it? Why, you and me, was the undaunted reply. That's very well said, returned the lawyer. And whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser. There's an axe in the theater, continued Poole, and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself. Poker as in, like the fire, like the long iron stick that pokes the fire. The lawyer took that rude but weighty instrument into his hand and balanced it. You know, Poole, he said, looking up, that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril. You may say so, sir, indeed, returned the butler. It is well then that we should be frank, said the other. We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean breast. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognize it? Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up that I could hardly swear to that, was the answer. But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde? Why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had the same quick, light way with it. And then who else could have gotten in by the laboratory door? You have not forgot, sir, that at the time of the murder, he had still the key with him. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if you ever met this Mr. Hyde? Yes, said the attorney. I once spoke with him. Then you must know as well as the rest of us, there was something queer about that gentleman, something that gave a man a turn. I don't know rightly how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt it with your marrow, kind of cold and thin. I own I felt something of what you describe, said Mr. Utterson. Quite so, sir, returned Poole. Well, when that masked thing, like a monkey, jumped from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book learned enough for that. But a man has his feelings, and I give you my Bible word, it was Mr. Hyde. Aye, said the lawyer. My fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded. Evil was sure to come of that connection. Aye, truly. I believe you. I believe poor Harry is killed. And I believe his murderer, for what purpose God can only tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be vengeance. Call Bradshaw. The footman came at the summons, very white and nervous. Pull yourself together, Bradshaw, said the lawyer. This suspense, I know, is telling upon all of you, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Poole here and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. Meanwhile, lest anything should really be amiss, or any malefactor seek to escape by the back, you and the boy must go around the corner with a pair of good sticks and take your post at the laboratory door. We'll give you 10 minutes to get to your stations. As Bradshaw left, the lawyer looked at his watch. And now, Poole, let us get to ours, he said. Taking the poker under his arm, he led the way into the yard. The scud had banked over the moon, and it was now quite dark. The wind, which only brought in puffs and draughts into that deep well of the building, tossed the light of the candle to and fro about their steps until they came into the shelter of the theater, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but near at hand the stillness was only broken by the sounds of a football moving to and fro on the cabinet floor. So it will walk all day, sir, whispered Poole. Aye, in the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist, there's a bit of a break. Ah, It's an ill conscience that's such an enemy to rest. Ah, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's foot? Trying to identify the footsteps. The steps fell lightly and oddly, with a certain swing. For all they went so slowly, it was different indeed from the heavy, creaking tread of Henry Jekyll. Utterson sighed. Is there never anything else? He asked. Poole nodded. Once, he said, once I heard it weeping. Weeping? How that? Said the lawyer, conscious of a sudden chill of horror. Weeping like a woman or a lost soul, said the butler. I came away with that upon my heart, that I could have wept too. By now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack. And they drew near with bated breath to where the patient foot was still going up and down in the quiet of the night. Jekyll, cried Utterson with a loud voice, I demand to see you. He paused for a moment, but there came no reply. I give you fair warning. Our suspicions are aroused, and I must and shall see you, he resumed. If not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by brute force. Utterson, said the voice, for God's sake, have mercy. Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's, cried Utterson. Down with the door, Poole. Poole swung the axe over his shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leaped against the lock and the hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and the frame bounded. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough and the fittings were of excellent workmanship. And it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in sunder and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet. The besiegers, appalled by their own riot and the stillness that had succeeded, stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes, in the quiet lamplight, a good fire glowing and chattering on the hearth, the kettle singing its thin strain, a drawer or two open, papers neatly set forth on the business table, and nearer the fire, the things laid out for tea. The quietest room you would ever have said, but for the glazed presses full of the chemicals. The most commonplace that night in London. It was the calmest room that you could imagine when everything was still and they were done beating down the door. Looking in, everything looked peaceful. Right in the midst, we're at the good part, there lay the body of a man, sorely contorted and still twitching. He's dying. They drew near on a man. They don't know. They drew near on tippy toe and turned it on his back and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes that were far too large for him. Clothes of the doctor's bigness. The cords of his face still moved with a semblance of life, but life was quite gone. And by the crushed file in the hand and the strong smell of kernels that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer. So what do we think that Hyde did to himself? Killed himself. Mm-hmm. We have come too late, he said sternly. Mm-hmm. Whether to save or punish, Hyde is gone to his account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master. Stay back, Zion. Let him sign out first. Okay. All right. Y'all just keep some distance between you. The far greater portion of the building was occupied by the theater, which filled almost the whole ground story and was lighted from above, and by the cabinet, which formed an upper story and was at one end and looked upon the court. A corridor joined the theater to the door on the by street, and with this, the cabinet communicated separately by another flight of stairs. There were besides a few dark closets and a spacious cellar. All these they now thoroughly examined. So they're looking for Dr. Jekyll, okay? Each closet needed but a glance, for all were empty, and all in all, by the dust that fell from their doors, had stood long unopened. The cellar indeed was filled with crazy lumber, mostly dating from the times of the surgeon who was Jekyll's predecessor. But even as they opened the door, they were advertised of the uselessness of further search by the fall of the perfect mat of cobweb which had for years sealed up the entrance. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flags of the corridor. "He must be buried here," he said, hearkening to the sound. "Or he may have fled," said Utterson. And he turned to examine the door in the by street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flags, they found the key, already stained with rust. "This does not look like use," observed the lawyer. "Use," echoed Poole. "Do you not see, sir? It is broken, much like as if a man had stomped it. He broke the key." "Ah," continued Utterson, "and the fractures too are rusty." The two men looked at each other with a scare. "This is beyond me, Poole," said the lawyer. "Let us go back into the cabinet." They mounted the stair in silence, and still with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had been prevented. "That's the same drug I was always bringing him," said Poole, and even as he spoke, the kettle, with a startling noise, boiled over. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cozily up, and the tea things stood ready to the sitter's elbow, the very sugar in the cup. There were several books on a shelf. One lay beside the tea things, open, and Utterson was amazed to find it a copy of a pious work for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem. It was a book that Dr. Jekyll loved, okay? Annotated in his own hand, with startling blasphemies. Next, in the course of their review of the chamber, the searchers came to the cheval glass. Into those depths they looked in with an involuntary horror, but it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, the fire sparkling in 100 repetitions along the glazed front of the presses, and their own pale and fearful countenances stooping to look in. The cheval glass is like a mirror, okay, that they're looking in. They can't see anything of particular. They just see their own reflections. "This glass has seen some strange things," whispered Poole. "And surely none stranger than itself," echoed the lawyer in the same tones. "For what did Jekyll—" He caught himself up at the word with a start, and then conquering the weakness, "What could Jekyll want with it?" he said. "You may say that," said Poole. Next they turned to the business table. On the desk, among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost, and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one that he had returned 6 months before. to serve as a testament in case of death and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. But in place of the name of Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with indescribable amazement, read the name Gabriel John Utterson. He looked at Poole and then back at the paper, and last of all at the dead malefactor stretched upon the carpet. "My head goes round," he said. "He has been all these days in possession. He had no cause to like me. He must have raged to see himself displaced, and he has not destroyed this document." He caught up the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand and dated at the top. "Oh, Poole," the lawyer cried, "he was alive and here this day. He cannot have been disposed of in such short a space. He must still be alive. He must have fled. And then, why fled? And how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe." "Why don't you read it, sir?" asked Poole. "Because I fear," replied the lawyer solemnly. "God grant I have no cause for it." And with that, he brought the paper to his eyes and read as follows. "My dear Utterson, when all this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances I have not the penetration to foresee, but my instinct and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then, and first read the narrative which Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands. And if you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll." "There was a third enclosure?" asked Utterson. "Here, sir," said Poole, and gave into his hands a considerable packet sealed in several places. The lawyer put it in his pocket. "I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or is dead, we may at least save his credit. It is now 10. I must go home and read these documents in quiet, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police." Then they went out, locking the door of the theater behind them, and Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the two narratives in which this mystery is now to be explained. Okay? So our next chapter is Dr. Lanyon's narrative. This is a letter that Dr. Jekyll wrote to Dr. Lanyon. Okay. This is our answer to what happened to Dr. Lanyon. Okay. Remember, he experienced a great shock. Okay. This letter is going to explain it. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. This is Dr. Lanyon talking. This is like a flashback, because right now we know that Dr. Lanyon is dead. So this is something that happened prior to the death of Lanyon. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man and dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify the formality of registration in Gilman's story. Okay. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. 10th of December, 18, question mark. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend on you, I would not have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, My life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose, after this preface, that I'm going to ask you something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. He's about to ask him for a favor. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight, even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone. To open the glazed press, letter E, on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or, which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you. But even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents: some powders, a file, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square, exactly as it stands. So that seems pretty kind of weird, but it's doable. He wants Dr. Lanyon to run over to his laboratory and break into this cabinet, get the drawer out of the chest, and just bring it home with him. Kind of weird, but hey, it's doable, right? That's the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to be done. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Okay? So number one was to go get the drawer and bring it home. The second part of it, he's to wait till midnight, and somebody is going to come to his door saying that he's a messenger sent by Dr. Jekyll, and he is to give this person that drawer that has the powders in it and the notebook and the files. Okay? And it's a matter of life and death, because that's what Dr. Jekyll says here. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility, that things might not go as planned. Think of me at this hour in a strange place, laboring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, H.J. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck my soul. It is possible that the post office might fail me and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day. And once more, expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late. And if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon the reading of this letter, I made my colleague, or I was sure my colleague was insane, but that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt. I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge its importance. And an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom, that's a cab, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. He had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Mr. Denman's surgical theater, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered through the surgical theater. The door was very strong and the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used. The locksmith was near despair, but this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours of work, the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied with a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square, which is his house. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. Okay, Dr. Jekyll had been mixing it up himself. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white color. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half full of a blood red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus or some other volatile ether. And I don't know if you've ever smelled phosphorus, but it stinks. It stinks. It's like rotten eggs. That's what it smells like. At the other ingredients, I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there, a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word. Double occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of 700 entries. Now that's a lot. He's keeping a diary of his experiment, of his mixing of this medicine. Total failure is one of the notes that he wrote in his book. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me very little that was definite. That here were a phial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honor, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. And though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defense.